Interest and curiosity, part two. How do we support interest and curiosity in our students as motivations in our classroom for learning? There's a model of interest development that we can use to kind of think about how students develop interest over the long term. And we're not necessarily going to see all of these different phases in students in our classrooms within the course of a semester or year or even over a couple of years. It takes a long time. This was developed by Heedy and Renninger. It's discussed in one of the chapters, the Wenzel and Brophy chapter for this week. But we start off with this triggering of situational interest. This is a 4-phase model, so we're going to see 4 different sort of steps here. And at this early phase, the goal is to catch the student's attention. Think about this as in lesson planning as sort of developing a hook for the introduction to your lesson. You're sort of trying to make whatever you're learning really interesting, exciting, doing something to change it, to create novelty or suspense so that it's kind of really grabbing the student's attention, pulling them in. They can't be anything but interested or curious about what's going on. But that only goes so far. So if we want to develop a longer term interest or support our students in developing a longer term interest, we have to maintain that situational interest. So here we're dividing this sort of in the moment interest into the catch and then this holding pattern. So it's not enough to just kind of create some suspense around, let's say, reading mystery in your English class to develop an interest in English literature, let's say, but you need to actually hold that student's attention. They need to see value. They need to be actively involved in working on problems related to that topic. So these are both different phases of situational interest, but if you think about it as sort of this catch and hold, these are both happening in the moment. You're feeling interested, feeling curious, in the moment around a particular topic, and you really want it to be related to the content area. There's something called seductive details, which are sort of the flashy different things. For instance, if I make a PowerPoint and it's like got all these different animations or really fancy things, that might like kind of catch my attention, but it's not related to the content necessarily. So we want to catch and hold students' attention with information related to the really deep, important things we want them to learn. From there, what researchers have found is that if we catch students' attention, that can develop into a sort of holding attention. And it's not always your job as the teacher to sort of make things shiny and fancy and sort of, what's the word I want to say? Not fancy, but exciting, so that it's like everything is new, everything is really flashy, everything's really exciting. I'm always situationally interested. So there is evidence that if I had this feeling of interest, for instance, let's say go back to math class, because that's an example where a lot of students might not feel interested. You have a 3rd grader, you have a 9th grader in your math class, and you're trying to catch their attention, make it relevant, get them actively involved. If the student keeps feeling interested every time they go to math because they're experiencing lots of situational interest, that can start to develop into this emerging individual interest. We do also want to encourage students to seek out opportunities to have their situational interest or their state curiosity piqued. Not just that somebody else needs to do it for them, but once we see these situational interests, once we experience them over and over and over again, we start to develop this feeling of reward, this feeling of value for topics, for content. And so that can start to develop into this sort of emerging individual interest. I like math class, or I enjoy history, or I enjoy political science. Once we start to develop knowledge about the topic as well, is when we also start to see this transition from situational to the more emerging individual to the more well-developed individual interest. And I'll be curious whether you see yourselves as majors, either majors in education or pursuing majors in other content areas, whether you feel that this the topic of your major is something where you're sort of starting to just feel interested in it, or you kind of have an idea that you're interested in it, or you've had this well-developed visual interest for a while. I've known since I was in 5th grade that I wanted to be a teacher. I'm interested in teaching. I'll be curious to hear. And so the goal of this model is to kind of suggest that we kind of move through these different phases of interest development. And so as teachers, we can support the earlier phases with the hopes that students move on to later phases. Now, the reality is that we don't have that many well-developed individual interests in our life. And so we're not necessarily going to get every student to be interested, fully invested in every single topic. And so the questions that I then have as a teacher is, how do I trigger interest in the moment? So if I want students to feel interested or curious about what they're doing right now, what do I do? And then how can I get to them to move on to these later phases of individual interest? And I'm going to talk about this in terms of curiosity as well. I'm just using the term interest here because that's what the researchers who developed this particular theory, this particular model, used. So let's talk first about how do I trigger interest or curiosity in the classroom. And there's a ton of different ways. I'm going to share just a few here. The first big one is using novelty, surprise, suspense, challenge, doing things different that students aren't expecting that can generate feelings of interest and curiosity. This is one reason why some teachers like to do a demonstration of a science experiment before we get into learning about it more in depth, with the idea that it's going to trigger students' interest. Making material relevant. This is particularly important in terms of providing culturally relevant materials, culturally relevant teaching methods. So we need the materials to be relevant for the individual students who are in your class. Doing things like encouraging students to see the relevance of what they're learning, activating students' prior knowledge, prior background, so that they can see connections. That can make things more interesting to students in a class. Choice is a big one. Giving some but not too many choices. Too many choices often overwhelm, but a limited number of choices appropriate for the developmental age of the students has been shown to trigger interest, as well as providing organized, coherent materials. This has been studied most in terms of what students read and whether they find what they're reading interesting. If students perceive what they're reading to be kind of well organized, thought through, they make coherent, they make sense, then students tend to be more interested. So we tend to be less interested, less curious when we see things as being sort of disorganized or not making sense to us. And so these are ideas for triggering interest or curiosity in the moment. I guess here's the last one on here. Active learning strategies and social engagement. Students tend to, not universally, but often like working with others. So social engagement can support interest and curiosity. Important to note, though, this is not true if students perceive their peers as being judgmental, or if they worry about their peers' views about curiosity. So if you don't think the person you're sitting next to in class is going to appreciate your curiosity or asking questions in class, then students tend to worry about expressing that interest and that curiosity. And active learning strategies, where the students are not just passively learning, but they're sort of engaging in problem solving, working on puzzles, working on case studies, designing experiments, running simulations, all different sorts of things where they're not just passively receiving knowledge, but they're actively engaged in learning strategies, all ways to trigger interest or curiosity in the moment. And finally, if we want to support these long-term, either the sort of emerging or more well-developed interest and curiosity, a few ideas of things we can do, and I'm going to phrase them in the terms of the bioecological systems theory, because I've been kind of thinking about what is this context around the student that would best support their curiosity. And so there are some individual characteristics, these biopsychosocial factors that are associated with more interest and curiosity. The first here is background knowledge. So knowledge and interest tend to be positively correlated. So developing more knowledge tends to lead to more interest, and being more interested tends to lead to more knowledge in sort of a reciprocal fashion. Curiosity, on the other hand, tends to be triggered by the sweet spot in knowledge. If you know too much, if you already know the answer, you're not going to be curious to find out. But if you don't know anything, you don't know what to be curious about either. And so there's sort of this finding the sweet spot for students of their knowledge. Curiosity, in particular, also is associated with a belief that knowledge and intelligence are modifiable, that they change over time, that I can become better at something. That also tends to be associated in the same students who are more curious. So supporting the development of background knowledge about these different beliefs about the modifiability of intelligence, growth mindset is another word for it, that will support curiosity. We can also think about supporting or promoting contextual factors in the student's microsystem or macrosystem that will encourage curiosity or interest. There's some research suggesting that emphasis on high stakes testing is detrimental to curiosity. So if we sort of advocate for less high stakes testing, if we advocate for deeper coverage of content rather than just kind of like going from one topic to the next topic to the next, the sort of deeper dives into the content will support curiosity and interest. Classrooms that promote positive relation and trust with peers and teacher have been found to support interest and curiosity as well. And then in thinking about these firsthand interactions that trigger curiosity, the ones on the previous slide, things that you as the teacher can do to kind of support the situational interest, the state feelings of curiosity, and give students the repeated positive associations between the content they're learning in a particular subject area and this internal feeling of being rewarded by learning, seeing the value of that content.